Well, welcome everyone to AACC's Flourish Mental Health webinar series. It lies at the intersection of faith, mental health, and the Asian American identity. And in today's webinar, we're going to be learning from a wonderful sociologist, a prominent writer and speaker, our friend, Dr. Felicia Wu Song. We're going to be exploring how, despite knowing the negative impacts of social media and excessive screen time on our mental health, many of us feel trapped in our digital habits. And hopefully, we can undo some of those digital habits after this webinar. Dr. Song will introduce a new paradigm of freedom and practical life experiments as effective strategies for improving our mental well-being and making meaningful changes. And so we're so pleased to welcome our guest, Dr. Song, who's going to guide us through this discussion. My name is Ray Chang. I serve as the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative. And just to share a little bit about Dr. Felicia Song, she is a sociologist who writes on the social and cultural effects of digital technologies on community and identity in contemporary life. She was trained in history, communication studies, and sociology from this tiny little school in the Northeast called Yale. She also studied at Northwestern and the University of Virginia, and she's the author of Restless Devices: Recovering Personhood, Presence, and Place in the Digital Age, which, if you haven't read, you need to pick up, and Virtual Communities: Bowling Alone, Online Together. She speaks, teaches, and consults with Christian faith communities and leaders, colleges, and seminaries on how sociology and theology compels us to live more humane lives, and currently lives in Portland, new Portland residence, Oregon, with her husband, Ed, and two teenage children. Welcome, Felicia. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much, Ray. It's really great to be with y'all.
Well, I'm going to let you take it over from here, and then we'll pop back on for a Q&A after.
All right, sounds good. Hey, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to share some thoughts on our digital world and mental health. I'm going to be looking at some notes here so that I can stay on track and not end up talking for an entire hour. So I've been teaching undergraduates for almost 20 years, and I've seen a lot of changes in the students who come into my classroom. And one of the heartening things that I've found in recent years is that our students are no longer, there's no longer a taboo about talking about mental health issues. And along these lines, I'm so glad that AACC is foregrounding mental health as a significant topic for Asian Americans and Asian American Christians. I think when we are living in a world that is widely mediated by digital media platforms and devices that are really designed to extract from us our attention, our reliance, our data, rather than fostering a kind of interiority or compassion and freedom that's necessary for individual and collective well-being. I think mental health is something that all of us have to be intentional about cultivating and maintaining. So what I wanted to do today is start with a brief synopsis of what I see as what I'm calling the digital state of affairs in 2024. And this will set the stage for my main assertion today, that I'd like to propose that while there's good reasons for us to use what we commonly use, an addiction metaphor or framework for describing the plight many of us feel in relation to our compulsive digital usage, we might actually benefit in using a different metaphor, one that elicits images of food or diet, to move us practically towards a healthy digital life. So I want to be suggesting that when we frame our digital technologies as functioning like food rather than drugs, alcohol, gambling, we might find we can imagine more practical, creative models for living in a rightly ordered relationship with our technology. So that's where I want to go. So let's start with a brief synopsis of the digital state of affairs in 2024. So most of us live in a state of what media scholars call permanent connectivity. Our devices are a constant companion. We're perpetually online throughout the day. A very recent study showed that 83% of Americans report keeping their smartphones near them almost all of the time during their waking hours. Why do we do this? Well, a lot of us believe that our digital technologies are the primary means through which we can experience the good things in life: security, belonging, productivity, worth, creativity, fun, and excitement, which is precisely what the big tech companies and media platforms want us to believe. And at the same time, there's interestingly a growing cultural awareness and sensitivity to the darker sides of a life that is lived constantly online. Social media sites, excessive screen time, smartphones are often the common denominators to blame for the contemporary spikes in loneliness, anxiety, burnout, depression, political polarization, and social isolation. Many people today are reading Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness, which pins many young people's problems to their default mode of a screen-filled life. I think the book's popularity is evidence of how it is clearly striking a chord both in the wider culture and within the church. And of course, we all know that what we're dealing with today is just peanuts compared to the tsunami of generative AI-related technologies that are going to continue reforming education, work, healthcare, family life, and a whole host of other critical spheres of our life. So when it comes to the challenges that digital technologies pose to our personhood and our well-being, there seems to be no end in sight. So if this is the digital state of affairs that many of us are looking at around us, in our homes, how do we typically respond to these stresses and concerns? Anecdotally, what I see around me within the church, I've observed that, excuse me, people fall somewhere between two extremes. On the one end, there are those who have sought to assert control over the situation. We might call these people the digitally virtuous. These are the folks who have read the books, they're listening to the experts, they've gone about setting up a system to try to keep themselves and their loved ones, quote, safe from the negative sides of digital technologies. There are strict rules about when children get their phones or get on certain social media sites. There are digital mechanisms that might turn off the Wi-Fi at certain times in their homes. There are digital Sabbaths that are intentionally taken together. Maybe some people even dare to have a flip phone instead of a smartphone. On the other end, there are those who are simply a mess when it comes to responding to the stresses and concerns of the digital world. They're trying to hold the line with certain rules, certain boundaries, but mainly they feel stressed out. They're stymied, they're overwhelmed by all the bad news that we keep hearing about the effects, especially on our young people, and feel unable to fight every wave of digital pressure and every new application that comes on the scene in our own lives, the lives of our partners, and the lives of our children. So between these two extremes, we might fall somewhere in between. Whatever it is, many of us are familiar with the ways in which we talk about the excesses of screen time and the negative effects of social media and our devices in terms of, quote, addiction. And there are certainly good reasons for imagining how our relationship with our technologies are like addictions. So a couple ways, right? Most obviously, the reliance and inability to regulate our digital usage is similar to that of drug, alcohol, or gambling addictions. The neuroscience especially shows that the chemical mechanisms of habituation are the same, whether it's gambling or being online. And when we compare digital compulsions with traditional forms of addictions, we see many other dynamics that are similar. First, as time goes by, it's harder and harder to achieve the same high or the same degree of satisfaction. So our addictions grow deeper. Second, when access to the substance or behavior is cut off, the withdrawal symptoms of anxiety, nervousness, anger are the same and very much rooted in the same physiological realities. And third, the motivation to seek certain substances or behaviors being online are often also the same. We are often driven there out of a desire to escape, to avoid problems, to dull the pain of loneliness or distress or despair. And while these are all compelling reasons to regard our technologies as functioning in the same way that traditional addictive agents have wrought havoc in people's lives, what I want to consider today is how this metaphor of addiction can sometimes run aground and actually limit our ability to work towards practical and generative solutions in our lives. First, there's some places where the parallels between drug or alcohol addiction, say, and compulsive online usage simply don't line up, right? Some might point to the fact that for most people, excessive reliance on their devices doesn't completely lead to financial or relational damage in the same way that traditional addictions might. And unlike drug, alcohol, or gambling, how they're viewed as vices, it's interesting to think about how it is that high digital usage is actually quite socially acceptable, even perceived as being necessary for worldly success. But what I'd like us to focus on today is where the addiction framework for digital usage can backfire when trying to actually motivate ourselves or other people to make changes in their digital habits. First, I think when we talk about someone's online habits as an addiction, it can sound like a hyperbole, an exaggeration, right? And therefore it's easy to deny. People can say, oh, it's not that bad, or I'm not as bad as that person, him or her. And certainly it's the case that when we look at the 12-step program in Alcoholics Anonymous, they recognize what we all know to be true. Most people who are addicted are not going to be inclined to admit that they have a problem. So saying that someone is addicted doesn't actually help them. Second, the addiction approach can also be unproductive for a kind of different kind of person, right? So there's the one kind of person that's just going to deny it. Then there's a different kind of person who's going to receive it, internalize it, and then it's going to shut them down. This person might be someone that already carries a fair bit of shame or guilt in their identity, in their personhood. And to suggest that they're digitally addicted just adds to that shame. And now they identify as a failure in that regard as well, and how they have disappointed themselves and the people around us, and that shuts them down from moving forward. So because our culture renders addicts and addiction as fairly deviant, I think there might be a lot of good reasons to actually shift away from this framework and think about how our relationships with digital technologies might work better within a diet framework. So what the diet model suggests is that our digital technologies are more like food. Eating food is something we all need to do, but we all have different relationships with food that end up being beneficial or harmful to us. So here's a couple ways of how that parallel works. Some of us have certain eating compulsions or a diagnosable eating disorder even. These unhealthy tendencies are often tied to deeper needs that might deserve clinical or therapeutic attention. And it is often the same with some of our digital appetites and uses. But we all understand that with food, just because we may have an eating disorder, it doesn't mean we stop eating food. Rather, the solution lies in working towards freedom in that relationship with food. It may be the same then with our digital technologies. How do we properly relate to food and our technologies then? Also, with food, we might recognize that we have diets that can be more harmful or create greater barriers for us, and that changing those diets can be beneficial, giving us new energy, better health. So some of us might have actual food allergies that require curtailing from certain foods altogether. Many of us might have dietary restrictions. We might be gluten-free or lactose-free because we find that we are fatigued, lethargic, or have chronic GI problems when we do consume gluten or lactose. So when we remove these aspects of our diet, we can discover that we have parts of our life back. We have more freedom, less suffering, more opportunities, renewed strength. And in this way, some of us might find it useful to think of our relationships with our digital devices in the same way as dietary restrictions, right? It's not something that's necessarily intrinsically bad. It isn't necessarily life-threatening, but wow, your life can be much more meaningful or altered in profound ways that help you be more free, and discover new aspects of life that you had forgotten if you hadn't changed your diet. So in the same way that it serves us well to pay attention to how our bodies respond to the foods that we eat, we might do the same in paying attention to how our relationships with each other, with ourselves, our capacities to be with God are being shaped by how we use our technologies. I think the possibilities of the diet framework are particularly interesting for AAPI folks and for people of faith. While the diet framework might be particularly generative for Asian Americans because food plays a large part of our cultural identities, it might also be a less negatively charged approach that won't send us down familiar paths of shame-based or fear-based identities. And this ties with my inclination to believe that a diet approach might be important to followers of Christ, because when we are only working with an addiction approach, we usually find ourselves working within paradigms of deficiency or scarcity, where our focus is on cutting out the bad things in our lives, and we end up focusing on removing vices or sins, which are certainly part of our spiritual journeys, but can end up reducing faithfulness to matters of only following the rules or living out scripts of being good. Instead, with the diet approach, we're invited into working within paradigms of abundance, of freedom, of fulfillment, of community, when faithfulness is animated by a desire to know and be known by the God who is love, we end up living into a life of freedom rather than merely being driven by following the rules. In this way, I think the diet approach helps us stay attuned to the ways in which the issue of our relationship with our digital devices is ultimately a matter of discipleship. And what I mean by discipleship is not just a process of being good, quote unquote, but actually becoming a certain kind of person who's able to experience the love and freedom that God longs for us to live into. I really love James K.A. Smith's work, You Are What You Love, where he argues that all of our lives are made up of secular liturgies and counter liturgies. Everything we routinely do is forming us, shaping our loves, influencing how we understand what the good life is. And so much of our digital practices are often secular liturgies done unreflectively, following what everyone else seems to be doing, adopting the values that other people have, rather than pursuing the values of the kingdom of God. And so Smith encourages us to adopt counter liturgies, these practices that take on the form of resistance against the tendencies to say, go online shopping when I'm depressed or bored, and to actually reconnect ourselves with a part of who God is through nature, through other people, through solitude, that can all help us regain a new aspect of life. So I want to end with a few life experiments that I think we might try in our digital diets as we are trying to figure out what works best with our disposition, our own family life, our own life responsibilities that can become potential counter liturgies. So really easy, small things that we can try and see if it suits us. So we might begin by just experimenting with 15 tech-free minutes at the beginning of the day, right? So we might, instead of looking straight to our phone for our emails and texts, what would it be like if we spent 15 minutes making our coffee, looking outside the window, praying, whatever it might be? We can try getting an alarm clock. Amazing. And an analog or even digital alarm clock that is not our phones, right? And setting our phones beyond our reach, maybe even in a different room. How does that change up our rhythms of how we go to bed or how we wake up. Another life experiment might be that some of us are really driven to multitask, and we might try monotasking, right? Doing one thing and one thing only. So what will we discover about ourselves if we drive and only drive, or wait and only wait? We might discover that this brings about peace and calm, and that signals something that we should pursue more. Or we might discover that we are anxious and nervous, and instead of feeling dejected or a failure, we should be curious about it and ask, well, what does this indicate about ourselves? What can we learn? What can we pray about? I hope that our consideration of the diet approach and maybe even some of these life experiments can lead us to rediscover what actually energizes us, gets us out of our heads, gets us off the screens, into our bodies, and helps us not to be afraid of growing generous and free in our lives. There's so much that is a part of our spiritual journeys of learning about who God is that we discover through each other, in person and in nature. And we want to give ourselves the chance to experience that. Thanks.
That was so great. Thank you, Felicia. And what a wonderful way to frame things. I especially loved how you framed it as the digital diet within the Asian American context, which I do think, as you mentioned, fits with a broad kind of a broader a broader approach or perspective as well, or communities as well. Yeah, one of the things I've always kind of clung to was how much our diet determines our appetite, and well, we are literally what we eat, but as you were talking, I wondered if you, as a sociologist, saw something within the Asian American community um, that that made us struggle specifically when it comes to digital dieting and from diet and when it comes to dieting from digital media. Are there any unique ways in which we struggle as a community or a population? And w- w- you highlighted some, really helpful, 15 minutes in the morning where, you don't turn automatically to your phone. But what do you do if that's really hard? What do you do if that's really difficult? And so I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, I think with regards to what might be unique to the Asian American experience, um, I think it's interesting to think about how, because many of us might live in diasporic relationships, right? Like we are far flung from our family, we are far flung from our friends, and so the reliance on technology to stay in relationship with each other is real, right? We don't necessarily all live right close by, and so that's a challenge, right? That's a reality that we face when we're trying to think about how to not always be have our devices a constant companion. But I think in that regard, it is as it is with any kind of human relationship, right? Um, Parents and children, as each of them grow in their different ways, should not be clinging to each other the whole time. Partners should not be with each other 24/7, right? Like there's no health inherent in that kind of relationship as well. And so there's different kinds of growth and trust, and different kinds of independence, right? That we can all learn from those kinds of distances that we have. And so I think it's about thinking, how should I put this? Not letting the technology dictate what we think relationships should look like, right? Is actually starting with, oh, this is what a healthy family or healthy relationship looks like. How does this technology help me live that out, right? The technology is going to give us 24/7 access. It's going to give it to us, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's how we're built as human beings to be in each other's lives. I think it kind of goes along with, this is purely anecdotal and not from my reading or research, but I actually think, a lot of the Asian Americans that I know love what is practical, love what is efficient. It works, right? So that's why we use our technology, because it works for a lot of different things, and it's so true, right? Um, and those are good reasons to use technologies, but at the same time, just because something works doesn't mean that it may not be also having a negative effect on our lives. So here's an example. This is a slightly different sphere, but when scholars of globalization write about how fast food from the United States has gone into Asian cultures, right? They write about how the efficiencies of fast food are particularly interesting and appealing to young people, right? And of course, it's food that you can get efficiently. It's fashionable. It represents American culture, and yet Asian countries have had to struggle with the diminishment of Japanese tea culture, of dim sum culture, right? Which is all ways of eating that take time, that is relational, that it has its own rituals, right? And it's not to say that if you don't have tea culture or dim sum that your life is completely over, but it's just saying that there's something that is really rich and beautiful that is slowly draining away, withering away when we merely run to the practical, the thing that works, the fast food, right, that gets the job done. And so I think the imagination, as you were saying, Ray, right, that we need to be cultivating is one of not just what do our technologies let us do, and let's run after it, right? But what is the kind of life, the kind of culture, the kind of rich, thick, textured relationships and family community life that we long for ourselves, our loved ones, that we want to cultivate and protect, right? And how is it that technology appropriately fits into that rather than having the technology drive everything else?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, it's amazing how our one of the most kind of uh, pervasive means for connection is also one of the greatest hindrances to connection.
Yeah.
Which our phones are now. They allow us to connect in such efficient and effective ways, and yet they don't allow for the deeper connection or the more intimate connection. And it and in many settings, and then at sometimes, because we often connect with people that are not within our geographical locations, it actually helps cultivate a form of intimacy. And yet there's just so much to kind of like process through and work through, that it feels like a lot of people are confused on this. But I do think, like, what you mentioned something about their counter liturgies, and how you're how like Jamie Smith's ideas of counter liturgies as resistance. It does feel particularly relevant when talking about the digital age, but some of the language hints at the addiction mentality toward it that you cautioned against.
Mhm.
How do people know that they're addicted to technology? And then, if someone is struggling with addiction, they often turn to their addiction when they're depressed or bored.
Mhm.
And you really listed some important examples of counter liturgies. Would you be able to explain more of the practical examples of a counter liturgy that really resists digital media while avoiding the trap of kind of the addiction mentality? So
Yeah,
how do you know
yeah,
you're addicted? And then, are
yeah.
there any other kind of digital counter liturgies that we should
Mhm.
be practicing? And also, for those who are listening in, we're gonna I'll probably have like one or two more questions for her. But if you have any questions, we'd love to hear them. So if you type them in and chat them in, then we can answer them directly. So we invite questions from the audience as well.
Yeah, so how do we know we're addicted? Um, I've been teaching a class for several years called Internet and Society with my college students, and as a teacher, I get to coerce them with assignments that they have to do. So one of the first experiments that we do in our class is precisely to determine or to assess what our relationship with technology is. Um, The best way to figure out whether you are addicted or not is to give yourself a day without your phone. I know most of us are probably like, are you kidding me? I can't even spend like 3 hours with my phone. Okay, so try 3 hours then, right? Just find out, right? Like what happens when you're 3 hours without your phone? And you do all the things that you tell your boss, you tell your loved ones, you like, I'm gonna be 3 hours without my phone. I'm just doing this experiment just to find out if I'm gonna break into a cold sweat, you know. So you do it for 3 hours and you find out, am I breaking into a cold sweat? If you're breaking into a cold sweat, you're probably addicted, right? That's a classic withdrawal symptom, right? Some people, they might not actually. They might actually be like, this is fantastic. Why don't I put away my phone more for 3 hours? Okay, well then you're probably not addicted. So the only way, the best way, the most effective way is to set down your technologies, walk away from it for whatever period of time you think you might be able to do, find out how it feels. As to what we can actually do, and Ray, you had asked earlier, sometimes 15 minutes is hard, right? At the beginning of the day. I think this is where, again, I like the diet model because all of us are different, right? Like we have different lives, we have different family needs, we have different personal needs. I think part of trying to figure out what practical steps to take requires being really honest about yourself, right? And taking an assessment of like, okay, what are my realistic, what realistically do I have to do that requires me to be online? When is that? Where are my hangups, right? And what can I try to experiment with? For some of us, that might be time, right? That might be, I'm going to take 30 minutes of the day, and maybe it's not the morning. Maybe the morning's the worst time for you to do it because your morning's very intense. Okay, take 30 minutes in the middle of the day or some other time, right? And find out what freedom might lie in that space. Maybe it's not about time. Maybe it's about how you set up your space, right? So maybe it's about, could I have a place in my house or a place in my neighborhood where I go and I know that place is tech free? What would it be like to have that, what I call a sacred space? And that might just be a desk, right? That's just like tech free, or a couch or an armchair or a tree that you like taking a walk to, right? That every time you go there, you're just going to be without your phone. Um, and so there are different things that we can try. And again, I'm wholly convinced that we will find something that actually gives us life. Some of us can't handle doing nothing, so to speak, especially in the beginning, and that's fine. So maybe you go for a run, or maybe you play music, or maybe you pursue, you paint or you color or you bake, right? We all have these different things that we do with our bodies, that we have interests that we can immerse ourselves in, get lost in, right? Some of us that might be hanging out with other people, right? Without our phones. Go do that. We will find something. We all have something, right? That draws us out of ourselves into something else that we most certainly need more of to live healthier lives. And so we should figure out how to plug that in when we are bored, when we are depressed, when we are lonely, right? Have that written down, as our first go-to. I'm going to try this first, and give yourself a chance to habituate, 3 or 4 times and see how that goes.
That's so good. To add to that, it's kind of eerie how many parallels there are between our relationship with food and our relationship with digital consumption. With food, our country has been known in the past and really in present to have an obesity epidemic fueled
Mhm.
by a system that's designed for people to
Yep.
reach for junk food or fast food instead of healthy food. And obviously, there are lots of systemic challenges to eating
Yes.
healthy, including
Mhm.
costs and food supply chain issues. But then with digital consumption,
It's,
algorithms are designed to draw
that's the
people
thing.
in and keep
Mhm.
them hooked.
Mhm.
And they kind of work in the same way of of the marketing. I remember when I was a kid, those McDonald's commercials were very compelling and appealing to the point where after I watched one of those, I'd be like, I want to go to McDonald's. Daddy, can you take me to McDonald's? Mom, can you take me to McDonald's? The algorithms seem to work in that way, and yet they're far more subtle and they're far more
Mhm.
subversive.
Mhm.
What do we do in light of that? What systemic changes can we work towards to
Mhm.
help people with their digital diet? Because it can't always be on the
Yep.
individual,
Mhm.
to basically fight something that they have
Mhm.
no control over
Mhm.
in 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 the messaging that they're constantly saying,
Mhm.
especially with their digital diet, and then really to help make healthy decisions and how they spend their time. What can we do and see?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, that's where I think schools, churches, community centers are actually ripe for being spaces that equalize, kind of level the playing field, so to speak, certainly across classes, um, and can ameliorate some of these systemic problems, right? There are more schools that are adopting tech-free um, spaces, or at least setting up more guidelines for when laptops are being used, tablets are being used, and I think that's moving in the right direction. But I actually think churches and faith communities are completely equipped to create collective spaces that give people a chance to stop, to rest. You actually see this in Buddhist temples that um, open their doors and say, hey, are you tired of your technology? Come and join us to do meditation together, right? Buddhist temples do it. Christian churches can do the same thing, right? Christian churches and communities are actually very equipped with um, spiritual disciplines, habits of eating together, right? That can invite people into these kinds of counter liturgies. And exactly as you say, take the pressure off of the individual so that you can try to live into some of these new habits together and not just be going against the grain completely on your own. It does take incredible effort. What would it be like if entire communities, small groups did things together that made it easier, right? To go out and play, go out and exercise, go out and do something else besides sit on our couches and scroll the night away.
That's good. We're getting so many questions that I'm gonna skip my last question and just go into that if that's okay.
Yeah.
This is from one person who's listening in. It's a great question, right? How, because we live in workplaces where you're expected to be on all the time, and
Mhm.
so how do you get colleagues or managers in a system or an organization that is primarily focused on productivity and output to be more understanding of these strategies, to be less connected when
Mhm.
there are expectations to quote unquote be available at all times.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really good. Workplaces are the worst. Workplaces are probably the sites in which the most organizational um, reform, I would say, needs to happen. And here, I think it's interesting when you look at some of the Silicon Valley companies, Slack, um, Google, Apple, right? A lot of these companies that also value productivity, right? As much as all the other companies, they actually have really innovative, interesting policies that set boundaries for their employees concerning precisely this about availability, right? So I know some of these companies, for example, set it up so that when you go on vacation, all the emails that come into your box automatically, while you're away, automatically get expunged. The 3,000 emails that you got during that week have to get resent by everyone else because you're not expected to come back on Monday and start plowing through 3,000, right? Those companies realize this is not humane or realistic. It is on the sender to know you're coming back on what day. It's then up to them to resend, right? Apple tells their employees that they want them off their devices at certain times. They're like, we don't want you on your devices. We want you to come in fresh. We want you to come in rested. We want you to come in rested and creative, right? So they set the boundaries. So companies that actually do value and understand that human beings need rest and time away, right, from their work, they set up those boundaries. So those of us that might be lower down on the structures, right, it's difficult, right, to make those changes. But those of us that might be higher up, right, ought to start those conversations and say, hey, how can we change our work culture so that it benefits all of us to have these boundaries, and we communicate with each other. Hey, you don't get the promotion just because you responded to the email at 4 o'clock in the morning, right? No one's going to award that, right? And as leaders, we have to not be online at 4 o'clock in the morning, or we set our emails to only send at 8 o'clock in the morning or 9 o'clock, not at 4 o'clock in the morning. So we communicate to everyone, no, we don't want you to be up at midnight checking your email to respond.
That's good. Here's another question. I'm just going to keep going because there's so many great questions. You've mentioned our relationship with technology several times, and I'm curious what you think about the new prevalence of AI, easily accessible on our phones now. Previously, interacting with technology, it tended to be more robotic in nature, but it is now much more interactive and human-esque. How do you see that affecting how we interact with technology?
Yeah. So what's interesting about the current interest in AI is that um, back in the 90s, if any of us can go back all the way there was actually a lot of scholars that were interested in what was then called human computer interface, right? There was this interest in trying to understand, how do humans interact with computer output? And as the person posing the question is right on in pointing out, right, like clearly our computers are interacting with us in completely different ways now, right? It's much less robotic. It simulates human expression much more. And I think what even scholars back in the 90s said, what we need to pay attention to is actually not so much the degree to which computers can imitate the human. We need to pay attention to the ways in which we as human beings anthropomorphize the computer, right? Like, we are very willing as human beings to treat the machine as a human being. And that's super interesting, and also something we need to pay attention to, especially when we have to keep our eye on the fact that a lot of the AI that we are seeing now and that's coming down the pike is built on the foundations of generating revenue, of exploiting precisely our desires for connection, for belonging, for human interaction, and is created by human beings that are biased in their particular ways, that have their blind spots in their own particular ways, and so are going to be rendering what is considered human in particular ways as well. And so from the sociological perspective, our call is often, hey, try to always keep an eye on the fact that what appears to be neutral, what appears to be the truth or reality, is actually a construction that someone has designed, that someone has interests in, that someone has something to gain from our believing that. And so that's something we need to keep an eye on. That's something we need to continue to stay educated on, that we need to grow literate in knowing how to discern, how to interact, and that we do need to be, yeah, just careful with.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I remember watching this video of a robot that, looked like a human or a dog, and how the engineer or whoever was kind of recording the video or testing kept like pushing it down and shoving it, and the person leading the lecture or the class, I don't remember when it was, asked if you felt empathy for it, and I was like, I totally feel empathy for this robot, especially as it started talking and acting like it
Yeah,
was hurt. And it's a fascinating kind of thing to explore, especially as it's going to become more and more pervasive. um and yeah, I mean, we kind of are, in many ways, cyborgs. I don't remember who it was that said that. It might have been Jack Ma of Alibaba,
mm,
that these phones kind of make us a little bit, more technologically dependent, and so on and so forth. But another great question that just that came in earlier was, on how the how people across socioeconomic classes interact with technology. Have you researched or read any about any differences in how various socioeconomic classes interact with technology? Are there things that we see that we need to be noticing or taking note of
yeah.
across economic lines?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think what I find most interesting, when thinking about class differences, is the way in which what we have classically thought of as the digital divide is actually turning on its head. So we typically think that the more wealthy, privileged you are, the more access you have to technologies. And that's certainly true, right? During COVID, we saw that divide happen when, students in families where you had broadband internet, right, could do Zoom school in ways that were much more friction-free than students in families where they had to go to the library or they're sharing the internet with four other family members and couldn't do Zoom school, right? So that digital divide is for real. And at the same time, it's starting to flip on its head so that um, the less resources you have in your family or in your community, the more likely you are to be subjected. That is, you don't have a choice. You're subjected to um, online tutoring, telehealth, online health, right? You have to pay to have access to a human being, right? To have a real nurse come and talk to you or come to your home, right? And so the lower you go down the economic scale, the irony is that you are forced to interact with more automation that will appear and sound human as AI bots get more sophisticated, but actually are not, right? And so there's a way in which one scholar said that um, you we're coming to a place where human presence is a luxury good, right? You pay, it's when you can pay for a real teacher to come and teach your student, right? Instead of just sending them to an online interface, right? That's the luxury that we're looking towards in the future.
That is so good, and how true that is. It's the lack of options to see people face to face,
Mm.
as as the digital divide is becoming more and more narrowed, and so it's kind of like a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Um, Here's another question. Can Dr. Song say more about discipleship with technology, not just as a bunch of do's and don't rules?
Mm.
And how is that how it how is it how is that a spiritual practice? um I think the question is, how is it a spiritual practice more than just a bunch of rules saying do's and do this and don't do that.
Here I'm going to go back to Jamie Smith's point um, about liturgies, right? So if we think of ourselves as human beings that are um, always being formed by something, and we are always loving or worshiping something, right? Discipleship, the life of discipleship is a constant honing of those loves and what it is that we are worshiping and who it is that we are becoming. And so Jamie Smith says that when we don't think about, or if we're not intentional about the kinds of routines or habits that we engage in our lives, we are going to end up loving, worshiping something. It's just not going to be the kingdom of God, right? And so the key or the motivation then in discipleship is not can I check off these certain boxes to be a good person, right? Our motivation is rather understanding, wow, God made me to be like the Trinity in relationship to each other, in relationship to commune and experience love with God, with nature. And so how do I access that, right? How do I live deeper into that? So it's a back to the food analogy, it's about appetite, right? It's about how do I fill myself with the stuff that I know is actually going to be satisfying, right? So we might, if we just follow what the world tells us, we might think that going onto social media, making lots of friends, following everybody and posting all the time, right, is going to satisfy us, is going to give us connection, is going to help us experience communion. But a lot of us know from experience that it actually creates a lot of insecurity. It helps, it makes us compare ourselves to other people. We feel less than most of the time. We don't feel like we can actually be vulnerable or reveal ourselves to each other online because we're probably going to get doxxed. We're going to be, shunned in some way. And so the question then is, well, where do we seek communion then, right? Who offers us true genuine communion? How do we seek that? And a lot of the time it's actually not in these proprietary spaces that Meta has created, right? It's in these spaces that are often in person, that are long term, that maybe doesn't actually require many words. Sometimes we're just sitting with each other. And just being present says so much more, right? Especially in a time of need. So it is more about living into the life that we actually long for, that we know is promised to us in the gospel, rather than checking the boxes.
Mm. That's so good, Felicia. This is so great. I feel like the questions from the audience were wonderful, and it just shows how much hunger there is to kind of navigate the complexity of this technological landscape that we're in. It feels like in some ways we lose if we have no technology and technology doesn't continue to advance. And then we lose if it advances so much that we become so dependent on it that it pulls us away from interacting with people in like meaningful and substantive ways. I know for myself, with a toddler, we're actively navigating how much do we show her the screen, and when do we actually introduce that stuff to her, and seeing like how she becomes mesmerized when we walk to a restaurant and the TVs are on, and or to the hospital and the TV is on, and how stressful it is when we get on a plane and it's actually the most up to date planes where
Yeah.
all the screens are touch screen and all she wants to do is touch the screen and press the buttons, and us not wanting that to become like the thing that kind of shapes her mind and her brain, and then also knowing like we can't stop every other parent from doing it either, and how that's going to impact her when she starts socializing. So it's like it's a never ending a slew of challenges and struggles, but I'm just so grateful that you're doing this work to help illuminate and even point us towards a better way forward. Because in so much of, we're kind of moving in uncharted territories with the rapid advance of technology. And so we're just so grateful for you and for all the work that you're doing. If people wanted to stay connected with you or stay in touch, what's the best way to do that?
The best way is through my website, FeliciaWusong.com. If you want to find me on LinkedIn, I'm there too. But those are the two best places. Thanks.
Yeah. So you're not really on social media, which says
Uh,
something. And by the way, all the major, so the people that like understand the algorithms and understand the addictive kind of nature of social media, like that even work in some of these larger social media companies that we are all very familiar with, like they don't, they themselves are either off of social media or they don't let their kids on it because they see
Mhm.
the effects of it and how much it draws them in. And so it's a good word to us to really consider whether we should be on social media as well. Um, which is also challenging because we're like, oh, that's like one of the easiest ways to communicate with people, including like probably many of the people in this audience. And so maybe we just need to keep building out our email list. So encourage people to sign up for the email list, which, by the way, thank you for tuning in with us. If you haven't yet, connect with us online. Follow us on social media, but don't be addicted to following anyone on social media. And then sign up for our newsletter. You'll be able to kind of get all the most recent updates that we have. And if you have any questions, or if this has impacted you in any way, we'd love to hear about it, to tell us what was helpful and more of what you'd like to see with AACC. You can find us on all the major platforms at AA Christ Collab, and then of course our website is AsianAmericanChristianCollaborative.com. Check us out there, and then you get to see this and a whole bunch of other resources that are available to you. This has been another webinar on mental health and the Asian American community. Thank you so much for joining us at AACC. We look forward to the next time we get together. Have a wonderful day.